Hi everybody. Today's key concept 1.5 focuses on European society and the experiences of everyday life, how they were increasingly shaped by commercial and agricultural capitalism, notwithstanding the persistence of medieval social and economic structures. So before we go on and discuss some of these, let's go over some of these words so that you understand a little more about this particular key concept. Number one, as stated earlier, it is about the experiences of everyday life. We're going to focus on the peasants, on the middle class, and talk about just in general, even the new elite that developed during this time period. Furthermore, keep in mind that the economic theory of the time was mercantilism, but mercantilistic activity introduced both commercial and agricultural capitalism. This time of transition was important for the Europeans because in the European minds, there was still the persistence of medieval social structures. And what we mean by that, the use of corvée labor in France, the return of serfdom in Eastern Europe, and the dissolution of serfdom in Western Europe, yet the continuation of feudal dues. So it was a time of confusion, a time of great change, and we'll talk about that and the reasons for this change as we go through this lesson. There's a little more on the slides on this particular key concept, mainly because I wanted to make sure that everything that has to be covered and reviewed for the exam is reviewed and that you're able to think about it. So if I don't go over something that's on here, please make it a point to look it up if you don't understand it. But the first part of the key concept 1.5 focuses on economic change and how this produced new social patterns, yet traditions of hierarchy and status persisted. Once again, that mix of the medieval, the old way, with the new innovations. Innovations in banking and finance promoted the growth of urban financial centers and a money economy. And in the early 1600s, the Bank of Amsterdam was created. Later on, in the later 1600s, the Bank of England is created. And these banks furthered the development of a money system, of a new currency, and really helped investors to invest in areas, thus the formation of the joint stock companies, which were particularly used with success in England and the Netherlands. Joint stock companies such as the East India Company and so forth contributed to the growing English and Dutch settlement and colonization of areas outside of Europe. In addition to that, we're going to see the introduction of new social classes and the new elite during this time period. The new elite included the bourgeoisie in France and the gentry in England, and the bourgeoisie in France that developed into this new middle class were accompanied by the growth of a new group of nobles and the nobility of the robe, wealthy citizens who were able to purchase their way into the nobility. That contrasted with the nobility of the sword, who were the old noble families going back to the Hundred Years' War and prior to that period as well. In England, we're going to see the development of a very vibrant gentry class, and part of this was due to the primogeniture laws in England. In most of the European continent, all sons of nobles inherited the title. However, in England, it was only the first son, and so English noble fathers had to involve themselves more in business and commerce to take care of their other children, their other sons, and in doing this, these other sons who didn't inherit the land or the title developed into a class known as the gentry. And later on, we'll see their power develop, with the English Civil War, and with the English Civil War during this time period and their influence in the House of Commons. Hierarchy and social status were still important in both rural and urban settings. And although there were different types of hierarchy, they did exist. In the urban settings, the hierarchy was more of the gentry or bourgeoisie or nobility of the robe, whereas in rural areas, it was more the traditional peasant and lord or noble. And although, as I said earlier, serfdom had died out in Western Europe, many of the feudal remnants remained, such as the peasants having to pay the local lords for the mill tax and provide labor called the corvée for the local lords as well. And so hierarchy was still important in these areas and would continue to be later on. Another component of key concept 1.5 is that most Europeans derive their livelihood from agriculture and oriented their lives around the seasons, the village or the manor, although economic changes began to alter rural production and power. during this time period, the only part of the continent that was somewhat urbanized was the Italian peninsula, with about 25% of the people living in urban areas. However, in the rest of the area, urbanization only accounted for 10%. So throughout most of Europe, almost 90% of the people lived in rural villages. And subsistence agriculture was the rule of the day. In the north, there was three crop field rotation, whereas in the south there were two crop field rotation. And this is a fact that you are required to know for the AP exam, so I would make sure to know it. A good way that you can help to remember this is that the north was generally more economically successful in the Mediterranean region, and the three crop field rotation would mean that 67% of the land was being used to grow food, whereas the two crop field rotation meant that it was only 50%. Western Europe, as I said earlier, was less feudal, but there were still feudal obligations and a semi-feudal society that did exist and that benefited the large landholders in Western Europe. Also important to the development of Europe during the 16th century was the Price Revolution. And the Price Revolution was this period of this increased inflation and uncertain economy that occurred throughout the 1500s. The causes are twofold. Probably the most important cause was actually the population explosion as Europe recovered from pre-bubonic plague, the plague, and actually their population increased to more than it was prior to the plague. But also the amount of gold coming in from the New World greatly inflated the treasuries of Europe and led to this inflationary period. While few were able to benefit from this price revolution, many people were affected in a negative way, and it led to great uncertainty in some of the lands, and that uncertainty sometimes was taken out on witch hunts or charivaris or other social deviants from social norms that were targeted, a concept we'll discuss in a few minutes. As far as Eastern Europe, unlike Western Europe, serfdom becomes more codified and actually increases, especially in Prussia and the Russian Empire. In both Prussia and the Russian Empire, later on, we'll see the nobility gain quite a bit of power, and often that was at the expense of the peasantry, and many free peasants became enserfed during that time period. However, poor peasant conditions also led to some peasant revolts, and the best example of this were the German peasant wars of 1524 and 1525. Often, landlords tried to increase revenues or abolish traditional rights of peasants, and as a result of this, we're going to see these revolts in the German states during this time period. But these revolts were also triggered on by Martin Luther's Reformation. As the ideas of the Reformation reached the peasants, and the peasants saw that people could successfully revolt from the church, then what was to prevent them from revolting from their lords? Luther condemned these revolts in a tract called On the Violent and Murdering Hordes of Peasants. However, the peasants continued until 1525, and the peasant wars finally ended after the death of tens of thousands. In addition to the economic uncertainty in rural areas, population shifts and growing commerce caused the expansion of urban areas, which often found their traditional structures stressed by this growth. As I said earlier, the 1500s population expansion contributed to the price revolution, and because of the economic uncertainty and movements such as the enclosure movement by the 1600s, we're going to see increasing migration to cities, and this put a strain on city governments. They had to deal with sanitation issues, poverty, and crime, which are issues we're going to discuss in greater detail during the next period when we enter the age of industrialization. However, city governments were left with the task of regulating not just these urban strains, but also regulating public morals. There had to be laws regulating prostitution. The Genevan Consistory monitored the morals of private citizens. And ultimately, because of this area, city governments, there were codes on begging as well, and just new secular laws on private life. And this was forced on because of this just influx of more and more people to these urban areas, a trend that will continue on later on in history. all this, however, the family remains the primary social and economic institution, and it took several forms, including the modern nuclear family as well. Households often worked as units. There were gender-specific roles, and although the Renaissance and Reformation increased debates about gender roles in the family, society, and church, traditional roles did prevail. Often, women worked in the field in rural areas. Women worked in the fields as hard as men, although women were also required. They had different uh, positions. For example, doing the laundry, taking care of the household, taking care of the children. The family often worked together in rural areas as well. As far as the Renaissance and Reformation, there were great debates about gender roles. The Reformation, for example, stressed the idea of spiritual equality, and many women found this refreshing. Many of the earliest Protestant converts were females during this time period, and there were even debates about whether females should be able to preach or not. In addition, the late 1500s led to other environmental challenges, not only through the price revolution, but due to the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was this period of increased temperatures, which is going to lead to decreased crops, and it's going to lead many to delay marriage and childbearing. In a way, this restrained population growth and actually helped to improve the economic conditions of the families during that time period. Popular culture, leisure activities, and rituals that reflected the persistence of folk ideas, reinforced and sometimes challenged communal ties and norms. Leisure activities were often organized by the religious calendar and the agricultural cycle, and they remained communal. And the Catholic countries still celebrated Saints' Day and especially Carnival, a celebration that occurred prior to the beginning of Lent, their holiest season. During many of these festivals, peasants might dress as nobles, nobles might dress as peasants, and generally whole villages and communities got together in a uh, surprising way, not adhering to the strict societal norms that often existed. The Protestant countries had tended to have less of the Saints' Day festivals, but also they continued, along with the church authorities, to enforce communal norms and sometimes through rituals of public humiliation. For those of you who have seen The Return of Martin Guerre, at one point Martin Guerre is dressed as a bear, chased around town, and castrated. This was done because he wasn't having children, and it was meant to humiliate him and to teach him to do right. But often villages would do things such as a charivari in order to enforce communal norms. Another example is someone who'd be picking fruit out of season. They might be forced to parade around, or a man who let his wife beat him would be, both the wife would be punished as well as the man for allowing his wife to beat him. Finally, due to the uncertainty, we're going to see the age of the great witch hunts. And witch hunts had existed for several hundred years. In fact, the Hammer of Witches, I believe, was written in the late 1400s and talked about the proper way to catch a witch. But the great witch hunts, really the accusations peaked between 1580 and 1650. And some historians feel that they were more misogynistic in nature because a majority of the victims were women, often older single women who tended to live on the outskirts of towns. But other historians state that they were mainly economic because they often occurred during times of economic crises, especially towards the end of this price revolution during this period of economic uncertainty. One thing is for certain, by the late 1600s, the witch hunts began to wean out after the death of tens of thousands who were accused of witchery. Probably died out due to the influence of the scientific revolution and the influence of reason beginning to restrain some of the superstitious ideas, although the superstitious ideas and the folk ideas will really not go away even for another couple of hundred years. I hope you've enjoyed this review of Key Concept 1.5, and as we have finished Key Concept 1.5, our next review will be based on Key Concept 2.1 as we enter the period 1648 to 1815.